Picture this: a man so dangerous that mothers whisper his name to scare their children into bed, a gunslinger whose very presence could empty a saloon faster than a fire bell. But what happens when this feared killer discovers that every boastful word he speaks, every threat he makes, every cruel promise he delivers somehow twists back on itself like a rattlesnake biting its own tail? In the dusty town of Perdition Creek, where the sun beats down mercilessly and secrets hide behind every weathered door, Thomas Widowmaker Kane rode in with his reputation blazing before him like wildfire. He came seeking easy money, soft targets, and another notch on his gun belt. What he found instead was something far more dangerous than any sheriff or bounty hunter he'd ever faced: the strange, inexplicable curse of his own words. They say the devil himself walks among us, waiting for the right moment to collect what's owed. But sometimes, the collection comes in ways no one expects, and the payment demanded isn't gold or blood, it's watching your own cruel intentions bloom into reality, but never quite the way you planned. This is the true story of how the most feared man in 3 territories learned that in a world where words have power, sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one staring back at you from the mirror. It's a tale of justice served cold, revenge that cuts both ways, and the discovery that fate has a sense of humor darker than a moonless night. Welcome to Perdition Creek, where nothing is quite what it seems, and where Thomas Kane is about to learn that when you make your living creating widows, sometimes the universe decides it's time to return the favor. The dust cloud rose behind Thomas Kane's black stallion like smoke from hell itself. 3 days hard riding from Tombstone had brought him to the edge of Perdition Creek just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of Devil's Backbone Ridge. The horse beneath him was lathered with sweat and foam, but Kane showed no mercy. He never showed mercy to anything or anyone. Thomas Widowmaker Kane sat tall in his saddle, his pale blue eyes scanning the small town sprawled before him like a wounded animal. At 34 years old, he had already carved his name into the flesh of the West with 13 confirmed kills and twice as many rumored. His black coat hung open despite the heat, revealing the twin Colt peacemakers that had made him famous from the Rio Grande to the Canadian border. The silver skull buckle on his gun belt caught the dying light, winking like a malevolent eye. Perdition Creek wasn't much to look at. Maybe 24 buildings lined the single main street, including what appeared to be a saloon, a general store, a church with a crooked steeple, and a sheriff's office with bars on the windows. Smoke drifted lazily from several chimneys, and the warm smell of cooking food mixed with the ever-present odors of horse manure and dust. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business and asked no questions about a stranger's past. Perfect. Kane urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves drumming a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth of the main street. A few curious faces peered out from behind curtained windows, but most of the townspeople had the good sense to look away when his cold stare swept over them. He'd learned long ago that fear was his most valuable currency, and he wore his reputation like armor. The saloon doors stood open, spilling yellow lamplight and the sounds of conversation into the gathering dusk. Above the entrance, a weather-beaten sign proclaimed the establishment as the Broken Wheel. Kane dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. He tied his horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency, then paused to adjust his gun belt and check his weapons. Old habits died hard in his line of work. As he pushed through the batwing doors, the conversation inside stuttered and died like a candle in a strong wind. The saloon was larger than it appeared from outside, with a long mahogany bar running along the left wall and perhaps a dozen tables scattered across the sawdust-covered floor. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, where Kane assumed the working girls plied their trade. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. Behind the bar stood a heavy-set man with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes. His white shirt was clean but showed the stains of honest work, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal powerful forearms. This would be the proprietor, Kane decided. The man who would know everything worth knowing about the town and its people. "Welcome to Perdition Creek, stranger," the bartender said, his voice carefully neutral. "Name's Samuel Morrison. What can I get you?" Kane approached the bar with the unhurried stride of a man who knew that everyone in the room was watching his every move. He could feel their eyes on him, taking in the expensive cut of his clothes, the quality of his weapons, the dangerous confidence in his bearing. Let them look. Let them wonder. Fear was a tool, and he wielded it like a master craftsman. "Whiskey," he said simply, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone that had preceded violence in a dozen different towns. "The good stuff, not the rotgut you serve to cowboys and drifters." Morrison nodded and reached for a bottle on the top shelf, pouring a generous measure into a clean glass. The whiskey was amber-colored and smooth, probably imported from Kentucky. "Expensive," Kane approved. "That'll be 50 cents, Morrison said, setting the bottle within easy reach. Kane dropped a silver dollar on the bar without looking at it, his attention focused on studying the other patrons. Most were exactly what he'd expected: farmers, shopkeepers, maybe a traveling salesman or two. Soft men living soft lives, the kind who folded at the first sign of trouble. But there were a few who might prove interesting. In the far corner sat a man in a dark suit who looked like he might be the local banker or perhaps a politician. His hands were soft and clean, but his eyes held the calculating look of someone who was used to getting his way. At a table near the window, 3 cowboys nursed their drinks and spoke in low voices. Their clothes were dusty from the trail, and they wore their guns like men who knew how to use them. But it was the woman at the bar who caught and held Kane's attention. She was perhaps 25 years old, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight like burnished copper and green eyes that seemed to look right through a man's soul. Her dress was simple but well-made, and she carried herself with a dignity that was rare in frontier towns. She sat alone at the end of the bar, nursing a cup of coffee and reading what appeared to be a letter. "Who's the lady?" Kane asked Morrison, nodding toward the woman. "That's Mrs. Elena Vasquez," Morrison replied, his voice taking on a protective tone. "She runs the schoolhouse here in town. Lost her husband about 6 months ago. Apache raid while he was riding escort for a supply train." Kane filed the information away. "A widow. Young, attractive, probably lonely. The kind of woman who might be grateful for the attention of a strong man, especially one with money in his pocket. The kind who might not ask too many questions about where that money came from." "I'll need a room for the night," Kane said, finishing his whiskey in one smooth swallow. "Somewhere quiet, with a view of the street." "We don't rent rooms here," Morrison said. "But Mrs. Patterson runs a boarding house just down the street. Clean beds, good food, reasonable prices. Tell her I sent you." Kane nodded and turned to go, but paused when he heard the conversation at the Cowboys' table grow more heated. They were arguing about something, their voices rising despite their obvious attempts to keep their discussion private. He caught fragments of words: shipment, railroad, and tomorrow night. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. He finished his drink and was preparing to leave when the woman at the end of the bar looked up from her letter. Her green eyes met his for just a moment, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not fear, as he was used to seeing in women's eyes, but a kind of sad understanding, as if she could see right through him to the empty, violent core of his being. For just an instant, Thomas Kane felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. But the moment passed, and he pushed the feeling down into the dark place where he kept all his doubts and regrets. He had work to do in this town, and he couldn't afford to be distracted by a pretty face and sad eyes. Outside, the evening air was finally beginning to cool. The stars were appearing one by one in the vast canopy of the desert sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song. Kane collected his horse and began walking toward the boarding house Morrison had mentioned, his mind already working on the possibilities this town presented. He had come to Perdition Creek following rumors of a wealthy rancher who kept too much cash in his home safe and not enough guards on his property. But the conversation he'd overheard in the saloon suggested there might be even better opportunities available. A railroad shipment could mean anything from payroll money to gold bullion, and 3 nervous cowboys suggested that whatever it was valuable enough to make some people very worried. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house turned out to be a 2-story frame building with a wide front porch and flower boxes under the windows. It looked respectable and well-maintained, exactly the sort of place where a traveling businessman might stay. Perfect for his purposes. The landlady herself was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance. She looked him up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who had been dealing with strangers for many years. I need a room, Kane said, touching the brim of his hat politely. Morrison at the saloon said you might have something available. I might, she said carefully. Depends on what kind of guest you're planning to be. I run a respectable establishment here, Mr. Kane. Thomas Kane. And, I assure you, Mrs. Patterson, I'm nothing if not respectable. The lie came easily, wrapped in his most charming smile. He had learned long ago that a little courtesy could open doors that violence alone could not. She studied him for another moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. Room 3, at the top of the stairs. $2 a night, meals included. Payment in advance. Kane handed her a $10 gold piece, more than enough to cover several nights with money left over. Keep the change, he said. And, I'd appreciate it if you could have someone tend to my horse. He's had a hard day. Mrs. Patterson's eyes whitened slightly at the size of the tip, and her manner warmed considerably. Of course, Mr. Kane. I'll have my boy Jimmy see to your animal right away. Supper's at 7 if you're interested. Beef stew and fresh bread. That sounds wonderful. It's been too long since I had a proper home-cooked meal. Another lie, but Mrs. Patterson beamed at the compliment. Kane had discovered that most people were hungry for any kind of appreciation, and a few kind words could buy more loyalty than a month's wages. Not that he had any intention of staying long enough for loyalty to matter. His room was on the second floor, small but clean, with a comfortable bed and a window that looked out over the main street. Perfect for keeping an eye on the comings and goings of the town. He set his saddlebags on the bed and checked his weapons one more time before going down to dinner. The dining room was cozy and warm, with a large table that could seat perhaps 8 people. Besides himself, there were only 2 other guests, a traveling preacher named Reverend Hopkins who seemed eager to discuss the moral decay of modern society, and a woman who introduced herself as Miss Sarah Collins, apparently a seamstress on her way to San Francisco. Mrs. Patterson's stew was excellent, thick with tender beef and vegetables, and the bread was indeed fresh from the oven. Kane made appropriate conversation, playing the role of a traveling businessman with interests in mining equipment. It was a story he'd used before, vague enough to explain his presence in any frontier town but specific enough to satisfy casual curiosity. After dinner, he returned to his room and positioned a chair by the window. The street below was mostly empty now, with only an occasional drunk making his unsteady way home from the saloon. But Kane was patient. In his experience, the most interesting things in any town happened after decent folks had gone to bed. He didn't have to wait long. Around 10 o'clock, the 3 cowboys from the saloon emerged onto the street, their conversation animated but still too quiet for him to overhear. They looked around nervously before heading toward the livery stable, where they saddled their horses and rode out of town heading east. Toward the railroad line, if Kane's mental map was correct. 20 minutes later, 2 more men left the saloon and followed the same route. One of them was the well-dressed man he'd noticed earlier, the one who looked like a banker or politician. The other was someone Kane hadn't seen before, a lean man with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. Interesting indeed. Kane settled back in his chair and lit a thin cigar, the red tip glowing in the darkness of his room. Whatever was happening in Perdition Creek, it was happening tomorrow night, and it was important enough to make a lot of people very nervous. The kind of nervousness that usually meant money. A lot of money. He smiled in the darkness, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Thomas Widowmaker Kane had found exactly what he was looking for, even if he wasn't entirely sure what it was yet. But he would find out. He always did. And, when he did, someone in this quiet little town was going to learn why they called him the Widowmaker. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window glass and carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, that same coyote howled again, its voice echoing off the canyon walls like a warning. Or perhaps, if Thomas Kane had been a man given to superstition, like a prophecy. Dawn came slowly to Perdition Creek, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold before the sun finally crested the distant mountains. Thomas Kane had been awake for an hour, watching the town come to life from his window perch. He'd learned long ago that a man in his profession survived by knowing the rhythms of the places he visited, understanding when people moved and, when they slept, when they were alert and, when they were vulnerable. The main street gradually filled with the ordinary bustle of a frontier town starting its day. Shopkeepers swept their front steps and opened their doors to catch the early morning trade. Women in simple dresses and bonnets emerged from their homes to hang washing on lines or tend to kitchen gardens. Children ran past on their way to school, their voices high and clear in the crisp morning air. Cain dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would mark him as prosperous but not ostentatious. A clean white shirt, black vest, and dark trousers, with a string tie at his throat and his best boots polished to a mirror shine. He left his black coat in the room but made sure his gun belt sat correctly at his hips. In a town like this, a man was judged by his weapons as much as by his clothes. Mrs. Patterson's breakfast was as good as her dinner had been. Thick slices of bacon, eggs fried exactly the way he liked them, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She bustled around the dining room like a mother hen, making sure all her guests were properly fed before they faced the day. "Sleep well, Mr. Cain?" she asked as she refilled his coffee cup. Like a baby, he lied smoothly. He'd actually spent most of the night thinking about the mysterious meeting he'd witnessed and trying to piece together what kind of opportunity might be presenting itself. "Wonderful bed. You run a fine establishment here." Mrs. Patterson beamed at the praise, and Cain filed away another small debt of gratitude that might prove useful later. Amazing how far a little courtesy could go with people who weren't used to receiving it. After breakfast, he made his way to the general store, ostensibly to buy supplies but really to gather information. The proprietor was a nervous little man named Jenkins who seemed eager to please anyone who looked like they might have money to spend. Within 15 minutes of casual conversation, Cain had learned that the town banker was named William Harding, that there was indeed a wealthy rancher named Marcus Stone who lived about 10 miles north of town, and that yes, there had been quite a bit of unusual activity around the railroad depot lately. "Bunch of important men been coming and going," Jenkins said, leaning across the counter conspiratorially. "Railroad officials, they say, but they don't look like no railroad men I ever seen. More like the kind of fellows you'd hire if you expected trouble." Cain expressed polite interest while selecting a few items he didn't really need. What sort of trouble would they be expecting? "Well, word is there's been problems with bandits hitting the supply trains. Lost 2 shipments in the past month, both carrying valuable cargo. Companies getting nervous, hiring extra protection." Jenkins glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, then lowered his voice even further. "Course, some folks think the bandits might be getting inside information. Hard to hit a train unless you know when it's coming and what it's carrying. Very interesting indeed. An inside job, or at least the suspicion of one. That would explain the nervous meetings and late-night conversations. It would also explain why someone might be looking to hire additional security, or why existing security might be feeling pressure to prove their loyalty." Cain paid for his purchases and left the store with his mind racing. A railroad shipment, nervous officials, suspicion of inside treachery, and a bunch of locals acting secretive. It painted a picture of opportunity, but also of danger. The kind of situation where a smart man could make a lot of money very quickly, or end up very dead just as fast. He needed more information, and he knew exactly where to get it. The broken wheel was nearly empty at this hour of the morning, with only a couple of customers nursing coffee and reading week-old newspapers. Samuel Morrison was behind the bar, polishing glasses and preparing for the day's business. He looked up as Cain entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Morning, Mr. Cain. Little early for whiskey, isn't it?" "Coffee will be fine," Cain said, settling onto a bar stool. "And maybe some conversation. I'm a businessman, Mr. Morrison, and I'm always interested in opportunities. Word is there might be some interesting developments around here." Morrison's hand paused in its polishing, and his eyes grew wary. "Don't know what you mean by that." Cain smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "I think you do. I think everyone in this town knows exactly what I mean. The question is whether anyone's smart enough to see the possibilities." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the bar. Morrison was clearly trying to decide how much to say, weighing the potential benefits against the obvious risks. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "There's a meeting tonight," he said quietly. "Midnight, at the old mine shaft about 3 miles north of town. Some people think there might be opportunities for men with particular skills." "What kind of skills?" "The kind that require steady hands and a willingness to take risks." Morrison set down his glass and cloth, his expression serious. "The kind that pay very well but come with no guarantees about tomorrow." Kane nodded slowly. It was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. "I appreciate the information, Mr. Morrison. You won't regret sharing it." "I better not," Morrison replied grimly. "Because the people organizing this meeting don't take kindly to loose tongues or unexpected surprises." The threat was clear, but Kane wasn't intimidated. He'd faced down men a lot more dangerous than small-town conspirators, and he'd survived encounters that would have broken lesser men. Still, it paid to be respectful, at least until he knew exactly what he was dealing with. He finished his coffee and left the saloon, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. The town was fully awake now, with people going about their daily business apparently oblivious to the undercurrents of conspiracy and greed flowing beneath the surface. But Kane could see the signs if you knew how to look, the way certain men avoided eye contact, the whispered conversations that stopped when strangers approached, the nervous glances toward the railroad tracks that gleamed in the distance. His next stop was the barber shop, where he got a shave and haircut while listening to the local gossip. The barber was a talkative man who seemed to know everyone in town and their business. From him, Kane learned that Marcus Stone the rancher had been asking around about hiring additional security, that the schoolteacher Mrs. Vasquez had been seen talking to the sheriff quite a bit lately, and that several strangers had been spotted camping in the hills outside of town. "Probably just drifters," the barber said, stropping his razor with practiced strokes. "We get a lot of them this time of year, heading south before winter sets in. Still, makes folks nervous, what with all the trouble on the railroad and such." Kane filed away every piece of information, building a mental map of the situation. By the time he left the barber shop, he had a much clearer picture of what was happening in Perdition Creek. It was a classic setup: railroad money moving through a vulnerable area, local corruption making the shipments predictable, and enough greed and desperation to make people take stupid risks. The kind of situation he'd built his reputation on. But first, he needed to scout the meeting location and plan his approach. A man didn't survive 13 years as a professional killer by walking blindly into unknown situations. He'd learned caution from masters of the trade, men who'd taught him that preparation was the difference between success and an unmarked grave. He retrieved his horse from Mrs. Patterson's stable and rode north out of town, following a dusty trail that wound up into the foothills. The day was warming up, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the exposed trail, but Kane was used to hard conditions. He'd ridden through deserts and blizzards, crossed rivers in flood and mountains in winter storms. A little heat was nothing. The old mine shaft turned out to be exactly what he'd expected, a played-out silver mine that had been abandoned when the ore ran out. The entrance was boarded up, but there were clear signs of recent activity. Fresh horse tracks, the remains of recent campfires, and, most tellingly, several well-concealed observation posts that commanded views of all the approaches to the site. Someone was taking this very seriously indeed. Kane spent an hour studying the area, noting the positions of the lookouts and planning several different routes in and out. He also spotted what appeared to be a natural cave system higher up the hillside that might provide an alternative vantage point if things went wrong. In his experience, they usually did. By the time he rode back to town, the sun was approaching its zenith and the heat was becoming oppressive. He left his horse at the livery stable and made his way back to Mrs. Patterson's for lunch, where he found the dining room buzzing with conversation about the morning's excitement. "Sheriff caught those bandits red-handed," Mrs. Patterson announced as she served him a plate of cold beef and fresh bread. "Found their camp up in Devil's Canyon, arrested the whole lot of them." Kane kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. "Bandits?" "The ones who've been hitting the railroad shipments," explained Reverend Hopkins, who was sitting across the table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a sermon he was working on. "Sheriff got word about their location and rode out this morning with a posse." brought back 5 men in shackles. Caught them with evidence too, added Miss Collins, who seemed to know an unusual amount about law enforcement for a traveling seamstress. Stolen goods, railroad company strongboxes, even some of the money from the last robbery. This changed everything. If the real bandits had been caught, then, what was the midnight meeting about? Kane had assumed he was walking into a conspiracy to rob a railroad shipment, but if the thieves were already in custody, then someone was planning something else entirely. Or someone was planning to make sure the arrested bandits didn't live long enough to tell what they knew. He finished his lunch and excused himself, claiming fatigue from his morning ride. In truth, he needed time to think and plan. The situation was more complex than he'd initially realized, and complex situations were dangerous for a man in his line of work. Too many variables, too many ways for things to go wrong. But they were also more profitable if a man was smart enough and ruthless enough to see all the angles. Back in his room, Kane checked and cleaned his weapons while turning over everything he'd learned. The railroad was bringing through valuable shipments. Someone in town had been feeding information to bandits, allowing them to intercept those shipments. The bandits had been caught, but the inside man was still free and, presumably, still had access to information about future shipments. Which meant someone might be looking to recruit a replacement for the captured thieves. Someone with the skills and lack of scruples necessary to take what they wanted by force. Someone exactly like Thomas Widowmaker Kane. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The nervous meetings, the secretive conversations, the careful vetting of strangers. They weren't planning to rob the railroad themselves. They were looking to hire someone who could do it for them, someone who could disappear afterward without leaving any connections back to the respectable citizens of Perdition Creek. It was actually quite clever, if it worked. And if it didn't, well, a dead hired gun told no tales. Kane smiled grimly as he slid his Colts back into their holsters. Let them try to use him. He'd been underestimated by smarter men than these small-town conspirators, and their bones were bleaching in a dozen different graveyards. If they wanted to dance with the devil, he'd be happy to call the tune. But, first, he had some reconnaissance to do. If he was walking into a trap tonight, he wanted to know about it in advance. And if he wasn't, he wanted to make sure he understood exactly what kind of deal was being offered before he committed himself to anything. The afternoon passed slowly, but Kane was patient. Patience was another skill that separated the professionals from the amateurs in his trade. He spent the time observing the town, noting who came and went, who seemed nervous, and who appeared to be watching him in return. As evening approached, he noticed increased activity around the railroad depot. Several well-dressed men arrived on the afternoon train, and there was quite a bit of hushed conversation between them and the local officials. More security, probably, or railroad investigators trying to make sure no more shipments went missing. Which meant tomorrow's shipment, whatever it was going to be very well guarded indeed. Perfect. The bigger the security, the bigger the prize. And, the bigger the prize, the more someone would be willing to pay to get their hands on it. Thomas Kane was beginning to think this trip to Perdition Creek might be even more profitable than he'd originally hoped. The sun set behind the mountains in a blaze of red and gold, and the shadows began to lengthen across the dusty streets. Soon it would be time to ride out to the old mine shaft and see what kind of proposition awaited him there. He checked his weapons one more time, made sure he had enough ammunition, and settled down to wait for midnight. Whatever happened tonight, he had the feeling it was going to be very interesting indeed. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the desert, promising rain before morning. But Thomas Kane had weathered storms before, and he was confident he could weather whatever this night brought as well. After all, he hadn't earned his reputation by backing down from a challenge. Even when that challenge might very well turn out to be his last. The clock on the wall of his room showed 11:30 when Thomas Kane finally rose from his chair and prepared for the midnight meeting. He'd spent the last few hours in careful preparation, checking every detail of his equipment and planning for multiple contingencies. In his line of work, the difference between life and death often came down to seconds and inches, and he'd learned never to leave anything to chance. He strapped on his gun belt and checked the action of both Colts one final time. The weapons were perfectly maintained, as always, their cylinders loaded with fresh cartridges and their movements smooth as silk. He slipped a knife into his boot sheath and tucked a small derringer into the inside pocket of his vest. A man could never have too many weapons when walking into an unknown situation. The night air was cool and still as he made his way to the livery stable, with only the distant rumble of thunder to break the silence. The promised storm was still hours away, but he could smell rain in the air. The stable was dark and quiet, but his horse nickered softly in recognition as he approached its stall. Within minutes he was mounted and riding north out of town, following the same trail he'd scouted earlier in the day. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by, and his horse's hooves made only soft sounds on the packed earth of the trail. He rode carefully, all his senses alert for any sign of danger or surveillance. The old mine shaft looked different in the moonlight, somehow more ominous and foreboding. Shadows pooled in the hollows between the rocks, and the boarded-up entrance to the mine itself looked like a gaping mouth in the hillside. But there were definitely people here. He could see the red glow of cigarettes in several of the lookout positions he'd identified earlier, and the soft murmur of voices carried on the night air. Kane dismounted about 100 yards from the meeting site and tied his horse to a stunted pine tree. He approached on foot, making no attempt to conceal his presence but keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. These people were expecting him, but that didn't mean they trusted him. Not yet. That's far enough, stranger, called a voice from the darkness ahead. State your business. Thomas Kane, he replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. I was told there might be opportunities here for a man with my particular skills. There was a moment of whispered consultation, then the voice spoke again. Come ahead slow and easy. Keep your hands where we can see them. Kane walked forward until he could make out the shapes of several men gathered in the shadow of a large boulder. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he recognized some of them from his observations around town. The 3 cowboys from the saloon, the well-dressed man he'd assumed was a banker, and 2 others he didn't know. All armed, all watching him with the wary attention of men who knew they were engaged in dangerous business. Mr. Kane, said the well-dressed man, stepping forward slightly. I'm William Harding. Thank you for coming. So his guess about the banker had been correct. Interesting that a respectable businessman would be involved in whatever this was. But, then, Kane had learned long ago that respectability was often just a mask worn by the same kind of predators he dealt with every day. Mr. Harding, Kane acknowledged with a slight nod. I understand you might have work for someone with my reputation. Indeed we do. But, first, we need to be certain we're dealing with the right man. Your reputation precedes you, but reputations can be exaggerated. Kane's smile was cold and humorless. Feel free to test me, Mr. Harding. I'm sure some of your friends here would be happy to volunteer. The tension in the air grew palpable, and several hands moved closer to gun butts. But Harding held up a restraining hand. That won't be necessary. Your presence here is proof enough of your intentions. Let me explain the situation. Harding gestured for the group to move closer, creating a rough circle around a flat-topped boulder that served as an impromptu table. Someone produced a dark lantern and opened its shutter just enough to provide a dim circle of light. As you may have heard, there have been problems with bandits attacking railroad shipments in this area, Harding began. What you probably don't know is that those shipments have been carrying more than just routine cargo. He paused for effect, studying Kane's face in the dim light. The railroad has been moving gold bullion from the territorial treasury to banks in California. Large amounts of gold, Mr. Kane. Enough to make several men very wealthy indeed. Kane kept his expression neutral, but his mind was working furiously. Gold bullion from the territorial treasury would indeed be worth a fortune, probably more money than most men saw in a lifetime. But it would also be extremely well guarded, and its theft would bring down the full weight of federal law enforcement. The bandits who were arrested this morning, Harding continued, were small-time thieves who got lucky a few times. But the railroad officials think they've solved their security problems, which means the next shipment will be traveling with normal protection. And when is this next shipment? Kane asked.
Tomorrow night.
A special train carrying approximately $200,000 in gold coins and bullion, bound for San Francisco. The number hit Kane like a physical blow. $200,000 was more money than he'd seen in his entire career. Split even 5 ways, it would be enough to set a man up for life. Split fewer ways. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Harding? We want you to take that train, Mr. Kane. We'll provide you with the exact schedule, the route, and the number and disposition of guards. In exchange, we want 60% of the take. Kane almost laughed out loud. 60% for information while he took all the risks? These people thought he was some kind of fool. That's a generous offer, he said carefully, but I'm not sure I understand the arrangement. You're asking me to single-handedly rob a heavily guarded train carrying federal money, and then give you the majority of the proceeds in exchange for information I could probably gather myself. The cowboys shifted nervously, but Harding remained calm. You could try to gather the information yourself, Mr. Kane, but you'd find it more difficult than you think. The railroad has changed their procedures since the recent robberies. Routes, schedules, guard details, everything is being kept secret until the last possible moment. Except from you? Harding smiled thinly. I have access to certain information through my position at the bank. The railroad uses our vault for temporary storage when their shipments are delayed. I know things that outsiders couldn't possibly discover in time to act on them. It was a compelling argument, but Kane still didn't like the terms. More importantly, he was beginning to suspect there was more to this proposition than Harding was revealing. In his experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. I'll need to think about it, he said finally. I'm afraid that's not possible, Harding replied. We need an answer tonight. The shipment leaves tomorrow evening, and if you're going to act, preparations must begin immediately. Another red flag. Legitimate business partners didn't usually pressure potential allies into quick decisions. They were either desperate or they were planning to betray him. Possibly both. In that case, Kane said, his hand moving casually closer to his gun, I'll need some guarantees. Starting with a good faith payment and a more equitable split of the proceeds. The atmosphere around the circle grew tense again. The cowboys were definitely nervous now, and even Harding was beginning to show signs of strain. What did you have in mind? Harding asked. 50-50 split, and $500 up front to cover expenses. Plus I want detailed information about the guards, their weapons, and any special precautions they're taking. That's acceptable, Harding said after a moment's consideration. But we'll need the upfront payment back if you fail to deliver. Kane nodded, though he had no intention of returning any money, regardless of how things turned out. Of course. When and where do I get the information? Tomorrow afternoon. Meet me at the bank at closing time. I'll have everything you need, including maps of the route and guard positions. And the payment? Harding reached into his jacket and produced a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. 500, as requested. Count it if you like. Kane took the pouch and hefted it without bothering to count the contents. If these people were planning to cheat him, it wouldn't be on the advance payment. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Harding. He tucked the pouch into his coat pocket. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. The meeting broke up quickly after that, with the various participants melting away into the darkness as quietly as they'd appeared. Kane waited until he was sure they'd all gone before making his way back to his horse. He wanted time to think about what he'd just committed himself to, and he didn't want to do that thinking with armed men watching his every move. The ride back to town gave him plenty of opportunity to analyze the situation, and the more he thought about it, the less he liked what he'd gotten himself into. The money was certainly attractive, but the whole setup felt wrong in ways he couldn't quite put his finger on. Harding and his associates were either planning to betray him, or they were setting him up to take the fall for something much bigger than a simple train robbery. Either way, it meant trouble. But Thomas Kane had been dealing with trouble his entire adult life, and he'd learned to turn other people's schemes to his own advantage. If Harding thought he could manipulate a professional killer like some small-town dupe, he was about to get a very unpleasant education. Back in his room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Kane sat by the window and counted out the contents of the leather pouch. $500, exactly as promised, all in gold coins. Real money, not the paper currency that some banks tried to pass off as payment. Whatever else was going on, at least his advance was genuine. He was replacing the money in the pouch when something else fell out onto his lap. A small piece of paper, folded twice and sealed with wax. Curious, he broke the seal and unfolded the note, holding it up to the lamplight to read the message written in a careful feminine hand. Mr. Kane, if you value your life, do not trust William Harding. The train robbery is a trap designed to eliminate you and frame you for a much larger crime. Meet me tomorrow morning at the schoolhouse if you want to know the truth. A friend. Kane read the note twice, then held it over the lamp flame until it caught fire and burned to ash. Someone was definitely playing games here, but he wasn't sure if the warning was genuine or just another layer of deception. The handwriting looked like it might belong to a woman, possibly the schoolteacher Mrs. Vasquez, but he couldn't be certain. What he could be certain of was that he was walking into something much more complex and dangerous than a simple train robbery. The question was whether to cut and run with his $500 advance, or stay and see how deep the rabbit hole went. Outside his window, the first drops of rain began to patter against the glass. The storm was finally arriving, just as predicted. Thomas Kane took it as an omen, though whether good or bad remained to be seen. He settled back in his chair and began planning for tomorrow. If someone was trying to trap him, they'd find out that the widowmaker didn't go down easy. And if the mysterious note writer was telling the truth about a larger crime, well, that might present opportunities that even his current employers hadn't considered. One way or another, tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. Thunder crashed overhead, and the rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the roof of the boarding house like bullets. Kane smiled grimly and began cleaning his guns again. In his experience, storms often washed away more than just dust and dirt. Sometimes they washed away the people who'd made the mistake of underestimating Thomas Widowmaker Kane. And if that happened, he wanted to be ready. The storm raged through the night, turning the streets of Perdition Creek into rivers of mud and making sleep impossible for anyone with a conscience. Thomas Kane slept like a baby. He'd learned long ago to take rest when it was available, regardless of the weather or circumstances, and the sound of rain on the roof was actually soothing to a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping under the stars. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and spent the early morning hours maintaining his weapons and planning for the day ahead. The mysterious warning note had introduced a new variable into an already complex equation, and he needed to decide how much trust to place in an unknown ally who might not be an ally at all. By the time Mrs. Patterson called the boarders to breakfast, the storm had passed and weak sunlight was beginning to filter through the dissipating clouds. The streets outside were still muddy, but the town was already showing signs of life as people emerged to assess any damage and get on with their daily routines. "Terrible storm," Mrs. Patterson commented as she served him eggs and bacon. "Haven't seen rain like that in months. Good for the crops, though. Farmers will be happy." Kane made appropriate noises of agreement while his mind worked on other problems. If he was going to meet with the mysterious note writer, he needed to do it carefully. The schoolhouse was a public location, which offered some protection against ambush, but it also meant their conversation could be observed by anyone with sufficient interest. After breakfast, he took a walk around town to get a feel for the changed atmosphere. The rain had washed some of the dust from the air, but it had also revealed things that had been hidden. Fresh horse tracks leading out of town toward the railroad line, for instance. Signs of recent activity around several buildings that had appeared abandoned. And, most interesting of all, the presence of several men he hadn't seen before, men who wore their guns like professionals and watched strangers with the careful attention of hired muscle. Someone was definitely preparing for something, and it wasn't a simple train robbery. The schoolhouse sat on the edge of town, a small frame building with a bell tower and windows that offered good views of the surrounding area. As Kane approached, he could see children inside, bent over their lessons under the watchful eye of their teacher. Mrs. Elena Vasquez moved between the desks with grace and authority, helping her students with their work and maintaining order with quiet efficiency. She was even more striking in daylight than she had been in the dim interior of the saloon. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was simple but well-fitted, and she carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to being in charge. Kane waited until the morning recess, when the children filed out into the small yard behind the schoolhouse to play. Only then did he approach the front door and knock politely. "Mr. Kane," Mrs. Vasquez said as she opened the door. Her green eyes were calm and steady, showing no surprise at his appearance. "I was hoping you would come." "You wrote the note?" "I did. Please, come in. We have perhaps 15 minutes before the children return." The interior of the schoolhouse was neat and organized, with rows of wooden desks facing a blackboard covered with arithmetic problems. Books were stacked on shelves along the walls, and children's artwork decorated the windows. It was a place of learning and hope, completely at odds with the violent world Thomas Kane inhabited. "Why did you warn me?" he asked without preamble. "What's your interest in this business?" Mrs. Vasquez moved to the window and glanced out at the children playing in the yard. "Because I know what William Harding is planning, and it's not what he told you last night." "You were watching?" "My late husband taught me the value of knowing what's happening in your community, Mr. Kane. He also taught me how to move quietly in the darkness when necessary." She turned back to face him, and he saw a strength in her eyes that he hadn't expected. This was not a helpless widow looking for protection. This was a woman with her own agenda. "Harding isn't interested in robbing the train," she continued. "He's planning to steal the gold himself, using his position at the bank, and then frame you for the theft when you attempt the robbery he's sent you on." Kane felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "The train isn't carrying gold at all." "Oh, but it is. A great deal of gold. But it's not territorial treasury money as he told you. It's a private shipment belonging to Marcus Stone, the rancher. Money he's earned selling cattle to government contractors. Harding has been managing Stone's account, and he knows exactly when and how the money is being transferred." "And Stone doesn't know about the theft?" Mrs. Vasquez's expression grew grim. "Marcus Stone is dead, Mr. Kane. Killed 3 days ago in what was made to look like an Apache raid. The same raid that supposedly killed my husband 6 months ago, except my husband was murdered by white men who wanted his cooperation in their scheme and killed him when he refused." The room seemed to grow colder, despite the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Kane had stumbled into something much bigger and more vicious than a simple robbery conspiracy. This was about murder, theft on a grand scale, and a level of corruption that reached deep into the supposedly respectable fabric of the community. "Why tell me this? What do you want in return?" "I want justice for my husband and Marcus Stone. And I want to stop Harding before he kills anyone else who gets in his way." "Including me." "Including you. The plan is quite clever, actually. You rob the train as instructed, but instead of gold, you find empty strongboxes and a company of federal marshals waiting for you. While you're being shot down as a dangerous criminal, Harding transfers the real gold to his own accounts and disappears. The perfect crime, with a perfect scapegoat." Kane had to admit it was indeed clever. Use the reputation of a known killer to provide cover for a much more sophisticated operation, then eliminate the evidence when it was no longer needed. If he hadn't received the warning, he would have walked straight into the trap like a lamb to slaughter. "What evidence do you have?" Mrs. Vasquez moved to her desk and opened a drawer, removing a small bundle of papers. "Letters from my husband, describing Harding's initial approaches and his growing suspicions about the banker's real intentions. Documents showing Stone's financial arrangements, which I obtained from his ranch before the supposed Apache attack. And this." She handed him a telegram form, still bearing the official markings of the telegraph office. It was addressed to someone named Johnson in Denver and contained a coded message about merchandise being ready for delivery on schedule. "Harding has partners, Mr. Kane. This isn't just a local operation. There are people in Denver, probably federal officials, who are part of this conspiracy. My husband suspected it went all the way to the territorial capital. The implications were staggering. If Mrs. Vasquez was telling the truth, then Cain had wandered into the middle of a conspiracy that involved murder, massive theft, and corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. The kind of conspiracy that could get a man killed even if he tried to walk away from it. Why should I believe you? Because in about 4 hours, you're going to walk into Harding's bank and receive detailed information about a train robbery that will get you killed. And, because if you don't believe me, you'll never live to regret the mistake. Outside, the school bell rang, signaling the end of recess. The children began filing back into the classroom, their voices high and cheerful as they discussed their games and settled back into their seats. Mrs. Vasquez moved to the door, then paused and looked back at him. There's something else you should know, Mr. Cain. The men Harding has working with him aren't just local hired guns. Some of them are federal marshals, working under unofficial orders from their superiors in Denver. If you try to rob that train, you won't just be facing local law enforcement. You'll be fighting the federal government itself. With that, she opened the door and began welcoming the children back to their lessons, effectively ending their conversation. Cain slipped out the back door of the schoolhouse and made his way carefully back toward the center of town, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. If Mrs. Vasquez was telling the truth, then he was trapped in a web of corruption and murder that stretched far beyond the borders of this small frontier town. If she was lying or mistaken, then he was allowing paranoia to cost him the biggest payday of his career. Either way, he needed more information before he made any irreversible decisions. The bank stood on the corner of Main Street and Railroad Avenue, a solid brick building that projected an air of prosperity and stability. But, as Cain studied it from across the street, he began to notice details that hadn't been apparent during his previous casual observations. The windows were barred with heavy iron grillwork. There were at least 2 guards visible from his vantage point, and probably more inside. Most tellingly, there was a telegraph key visible through one of the windows, suggesting that the bank maintained direct communication with outside parties. All consistent with Mrs. Vasquez's story about a larger conspiracy. But also consistent with a legitimate banking operation that dealt with large sums of money and needed to maintain security and communication with correspondent banks and government agencies. Cain needed proof, one way or the other. And he needed it before his scheduled meeting with Harding that afternoon. He spent the next few hours conducting his own investigation, using skills learned during 13 years of staying one step ahead of the law. He visited the telegraph office and, through a combination of charm and a small bribe, learned that Harding had indeed been sending a large number of coded messages to Denver over the past several weeks. He talked to the town's doctor and discovered that Marcus Stone had indeed been killed in an Apache raid, but that the body had been so badly mutilated that positive identification was difficult. Most significantly, he managed to get a look at the passenger manifest for the afternoon train from the territorial capital. Among the expected arrivals were 3 men listed as government officials with no further details provided. Federal marshals, almost certainly. Just as Mrs. Vasquez had warned. By the time he made his way to the bank for his scheduled meeting with Harding, Thomas Cain had reached a decision. He was going to play along with the banker's scheme, but on his own terms and with his own agenda. If Harding wanted to use him as a scapegoat, he'd find out that some goats had very sharp horns. The bank was busy with afternoon customers when Cain entered, but Harding spotted him immediately and gestured toward his private office. The banker looked confident and relaxed, obviously believing that his scheme was proceeding according to plan. Mr. Cain, punctual as always. I have everything you requested. Harding's office was luxuriously appointed, with a large desk, leather chairs, and oil paintings on the walls. But Cain's attention was immediately drawn to the large safe in the corner, its massive steel door standing slightly ajar to reveal stacks of currency and several wooden boxes that could only contain gold coins. Impressive, Cain said, nodding toward the safe. I can see why the railroad trusts you with their business. Harding smiled proudly. Security and discretion, Mr. Cain. The cornerstones of successful banking. He moved to his desk and opened a drawer, removing a sheaf of papers. Now, about tonight's operation. For the next 30 minutes, Harding provided detailed information about the train schedule, route, and security arrangements. The information was comprehensive and appeared genuine, exactly the sort of intelligence that would be needed to successfully rob a heavily guarded shipment. But Kane noticed several inconsistencies with what he'd learned from other sources, small details that suggested Harding was carefully steering him toward a specific course of action. "One more thing," Harding said as their meeting concluded. "We've received word that there may be federal involvement in the security arrangements. If you encounter marshals, it would be unfortunate if any of them survived to identify you." There it was. The real reason Harding wanted him dead. Not just to eliminate a witness, but to ensure that the federal marshals could claim they'd killed the notorious Widowmaker while protecting government property. It would make them heroes and provide perfect cover for the real theft. "I understand," Kane said, accepting the papers and tucking them into his coat. "Professional discretion." "Exactly. I knew we could count on your expertise." As Kane left the bank, he was already formulating his counterplan. If Harding wanted to play games with a professional killer, he'd get his chance. But the rules were going to be very different from what the banker expected. The afternoon was growing late, and shadows were beginning to lengthen across the dusty streets. In a few hours, the westbound train would pull into Perdition Creek Station for its scheduled stop, carrying what everyone believed was a fortune in gold and the federal marshals who were supposed to protect it. But Thomas Widowmaker Kane had his own ideas about how the evening should unfold. And, before the night was over, William Harding was going to learn that some people were far more dangerous as enemies than they ever were as allies. The game was about to begin, and Kane intended to be the only player left standing when it ended. The evening train arrived in Perdition Creek exactly on schedule, its whistle echoing off the canyon walls as it pulled into the small station in a cloud of steam and smoke. Thomas Kane watched from the shadows across the street as passengers disembarked, noting with particular interest the three men in dark suits who moved with the careful alertness of trained law enforcement officers. Federal marshals, just as Mrs. Vasquez had predicted. But Kane wasn't planning to rob any trains tonight. Instead, he was about to teach William Harding and his conspirators a lesson about the dangers of trying to manipulate a professional killer. The past few hours had been busy ones for Kane. While Harding and his associates believed their puppet was preparing to ride out and attempt the robbery they'd planned for him, he had actually been arranging a very different kind of surprise. A surprise that would expose the real conspiracy and settle several debts at the same time. As the train pulled away from the station, continuing its journey west with its cargo of gold and federal protection intact, Kane made his way through the darkening streets to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson greeted him warmly, as she had every evening since his arrival, completely unaware that her polite guest was about to turn her quiet town upside down. "Will you be joining us for dinner tonight, Mr. Kane?" "Unfortunately not, Mrs. Patterson. I have some business to attend to. But I wanted to thank you for your hospitality. You run a fine establishment." Something in his tone must have alerted her to the finality of his words, because her expression grew concerned. "You're not leaving us already, are you?" "Tomorrow morning, I'm afraid. Early. But don't worry about breakfast. I'll be traveling light." In his room, Kane gathered his few possessions and packed them efficiently in his saddlebags. He wouldn't be returning to the boarding house after tonight's work was done, and he wanted to be ready to leave town quickly if circumstances demanded it. He also loaded extra ammunition for his weapons and slipped his knife into its boot sheath. Tonight would be dangerous, but not in the way William Harding expected. As darkness fell over Perdition Creek, Kane made his way to his first destination, the telegraph office. The night operator was a young man named Billy who was easily impressed by tales of adventure and even more easily bribed with silver dollars. Within 15 minutes, Kane had sent 3 carefully worded messages to contacts in Denver, Phoenix, and San Francisco. Messages that would ensure certain interested parties learned about William Harding's activities, regardless of what happened to the messenger. His next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a worn-looking man in his 50s who had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much violence and corruption during his years in law enforcement. But, according to Mrs. Vasquez, he was one of the few men in Perdition Creek who wasn't part of Harding's conspiracy.
Sheriff Bradley? That's right. You're Kane, aren't you? The stranger who's been asking a lot of questions around town.
Guilty as charged.
I have some information you might find interesting.
Information about William Harding and a conspiracy involving theft, murder, and federal corruption.
Bradley's expression grew very serious very quickly.
That's a serious accusation, Mr. Kane.
What kind of information?
For the next 20 minutes, Kane laid out everything he'd learned from Mrs. Vasquez and his own investigations. He provided copies of the documents she'd given him, explained the connections between the recent deaths and Harding's financial activities, and described the trap that had been set for him. So you're telling me that Harding murdered Marcus Stone and Elena's husband, stole a fortune in gold, and was planning to frame you for the whole thing?
That's exactly what I'm telling you. And I can prove it. How? Kane smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. By giving Mr. Harding exactly what he thinks he wants.
With a few modifications of my own. An hour later, Sheriff Bradley and 2 of his deputies were positioned in carefully chosen locations around the bank, armed with warrants and weapons and waiting for Kane's signal. Mrs. Vasquez was safely hidden in the church across the street, with instructions to document everything that happened and to get word to the territorial authorities if the local law enforcement plan went wrong. Everything was in place for the final act of William Harding's elaborate scheme. Except that this time, he wouldn't be directing the performance. Kane approached the bank from the rear, moving through the shadows with the practiced stealth of a man who'd spent years avoiding detection. The building was dark except for a single light in Harding's office, but Kane could see movement inside and knew that the banker and his associates were waiting for news of the train robbery that would never happen. The back door of the bank was locked, but Kane had learned how to deal with locks during his early career as a less than law-abiding citizen. Within moments, he was inside the building, moving quietly through the darkened corridors toward the light spilling from Harding's office. Voices carried clearly in the still air. Harding was talking to someone, his tone confident and satisfied.
It should be over by now.
Kane will have tried to rob the train, encountered the marshals, and been killed in the ensuing gunfight. By morning, the newspapers will be praising the federal officers who eliminated the notorious Widowmaker, and no one will ever think to look for the missing gold. And if he somehow survives, asked another voice that Kane recognized as belonging to one of the cowboys from the midnight meeting. Then, we deal with him when he returns. A wounded outlaw seeking shelter won't be difficult to eliminate, and it will look like justice being served.
What about the schoolteacher? She's been asking too many questions.
Harding's voice turned cold.
Mrs. Vasquez will have a tragic accident, I'm afraid.
Something that will discourage others from being too curious about matters that don't concern them.
Kane had heard enough.
He stepped into the doorway of the office, his Colts drawn and ready.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm afraid I have some disappointing news about your train robbery.
The 3 men in the office spun around in shock. Besides Harding, there were 2 of the cowboys who'd been at the midnight meeting, both reaching for their weapons with panic-driven desperation. I wouldn't, if I were you, Kane said calmly.
I'm much faster than either of you, and I've had a very disappointing day.
The cowboys froze, their hands halfway to their guns. Harding, to his credit, maintained his composure despite the obvious collapse of his plans.
Mr. Kane. This is unexpected. I trust the operation went smoothly?
Oh, very smoothly. So smoothly, in fact, that the train arrived in the next town exactly on schedule, with all its cargo intact.
Funny thing about that train, Mr. Harding. It seems the gold you told me about doesn't actually exist.
Harding's face went pale, but he continued to bluster.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Sure you do. Just like you know about Marcus Stone's real gold, the gold that's sitting right there in your safe. The gold you stole after murdering him and Mrs. Vasquez's husband.
You can't prove any of that.
Kane smiled grimly.
I don't have to prove it, Mr. Harding.
You're going to confess to Sheriff Bradley and his deputies, who are currently surrounding this building. You're going to tell them about the murders, the theft, and your connections to the corrupt federal officials in Denver.
And why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'm going to kill you right here and now.
And then, I'm going to kill your friends. And then, I'm going to take the gold and disappear, leaving your bodies as evidence of what happens to people who try to manipulate Thomas Kane. The room was silent for a long moment, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whistle of a freight train passing through the night. Then, one of the cowboys made a desperate grab for his gun.
Kane's Colt roared twice in quick succession, the sound deafeningly loud in the confined space. Both cowboys spun around and collapsed, their weapons unfired.
Harding stared at their bodies in shock, finally, understanding the kind of man he'd been trying to use as a pawn.
You killed them. They drew on me. I defended myself. Perfectly legal, even if it hadn't been justified. Kane kept his remaining Colt trained on the banker. The question is whether you're smart enough to avoid joining them.
Before Harding could answer, the front door of the bank burst open and Sheriff Bradley and his deputies rushed in, weapons drawn. They took in the scene quickly, 2 dead men on the floor, a terrified banker behind his desk, and Thomas Kane standing calmly in the middle of it all.
Sheriff Bradley, Kane said politely. Perfect timing.
Mr. Harding was just about to confess to multiple counts of murder and theft.
Is that so?
Bradley moved carefully into the room, his shotgun ready but not aimed at anyone in particular.
Mr. Harding, you have anything you want to tell me?
For a moment, it looked like Harding might try to brazen his way out of the situation. But then, his shoulders slumped and the fight went out of him. Looking at the bodies of his associates and the unwavering steel in Kane's eyes, he realized that his elaborate scheme had collapsed completely.
I want to make a deal, he said finally.
No deals, Kane said flatly.
Full confession, or I finish what I started. Over the next hour, William Harding told Sheriff Bradley everything.
How he'd gradually become involved with corrupt federal officials who were skimming money from territorial accounts. How he'd murdered Elena Vasquez's husband when the man had discovered the conspiracy and threatened to expose it. How he'd arranged Marcus Stone's death and stolen the rancher's gold. How he'd planned to frame Kane for the crimes while eliminating him as a potential witness. It was a sordid tale of greed and murder that reached from the dusty streets of Perdition Creek all the way to the territorial capital in Denver. But, with Harding's confession and the documents Mrs. Vasquez had preserved, there was more than enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy. As dawn broke over the desert, Sheriff Bradley and his deputies were preparing to transport Harding to the territorial prison, where he would await trial for his crimes. The banker's confederates were either dead or had fled during the night, but warrants would be issued for their arrest and the net would close around them eventually.
Thomas Kane stood on the front porch of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, saddlebags over his shoulder and his horse ready for travel. He'd collected his belongings and settled his bill, leaving a generous tip that had brought tears to the landlady's eyes. "You're really leaving?"
Mrs. Vasquez had come to say goodbye, her green eyes bright with unshed tears.
"After everything that's happened? My work here is finished.
Your husband's death has been avenged, and Harding will face justice for his crimes.
There's nothing more for me to do. You could stay.
Start a new life, away from all the violence and killing." Kane was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the peaceful streets of Perdition Creek. For just an instant, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to settle down in a place like this, to wake up each morning without wondering who might be hunting him or what new violence the day might bring. But the moment passed, as such moments always did. Thomas Widowmaker Kane was what he was, and there was no changing that. The best he could do was make sure his particular brand of violence was directed at people who deserved it.
"I'm not built for peaceful living, Mrs. Vasquez.
But I'm glad I could help you find some justice for your husband." She reached up and kissed him gently on the cheek, a gesture of gratitude that somehow meant more to him than all the money and fear he'd accumulated over the years.
"Thank you, Thomas. For everything."
He mounted his horse and rode out of Perdition Creek as the sun climbed higher into the clear morning sky. Behind him, the town was returning to its normal rhythms, the crisis of the past few days already beginning to fade into memory. Ahead lay the endless expanse of the frontier, with all its dangers and opportunities. But, for the first time in years, Thomas Kane found himself thinking about something other than his next job or his next kill. He found himself thinking about the possibility of redemption, and whether a man like him could ever truly escape the shadows of his past. As he rode north toward the mountains, a smile played around the corners of his mouth. Not the cold, predatory smile that had preceded violence in a dozen different towns, but something warmer and more human. William Harding had tried to manipulate the Widowmaker for his own purposes, confident that he could use Kane's reputation and skills while keeping